All right, I think I'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Fox with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations, and my colleague, Mary Louise, is with me. Mary Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're glad to be here, and we're glad to have y'all.
And we have Katie Roberts from DaSy helping us, and she admitted you into the room. So I want to acknowledge her keeping us organized, and thank you for coming. I know it's the last session, and we've been talking about data for 2 days now. So cheers to you for still wanting to talk about it and wanting to talk about coaching and practice change. Let me tell you kind of what we're going to do in this session and what we'll be talking about. So our discussion is going to be centered on how we help practitioners change in their use of evidence-based practice for the promotion of social emotional outcomes. So that's a big deal for our kids in Part C and 619, and that will be our lens. We're going to unpack for you the importance of using coaching. And so we're going to go pretty deep on that. What is it? What would it look like? What are the implications for the system? And our purpose in delivering this message is that I know that you are accountable for making sure that we can get evidence-based practices to be used within our personnel systems. And what we want to do is really help you understand more deeply and think about all of the implications of bringing coaching to your professional development systems, its importance if we're trying to get evidence-based practices in place, and considerations that you might have. We'll also share with you some tools to use. We'll have a little bit of a discussion because we want to learn from you about what you've been doing and what your experiences have been, and we find that for us to talk to each other has been really useful for you to be able to connect to others who are thinking about the same thing or have some experience in this in their system. So again, our lens is going to be on promoting young children's social emotional outcomes. So that's our North Star. That's what we're trying to influence. And the way we want to get there, of course, is the use of evidence-based practices. I wanted to put this slide in here to just touch a little bit on how we're viewing the differences between practices, an intervention, a curriculum, and a model that you might be using. So for example, in a Part C system, you might be using family-guided routines-based intervention, which is a common model that's used for family coaching. In that, we want to be using evidence-based practices. And so within that, there's a way to approach that work. There is a fidelity measure about whether or not you're doing family-guided routines-based intervention true to that model. But within that model is the notion of practices that we might use. And those practices, probably in family-guided routines-based intervention, are more closely tied to and aligned with and rely on DEC recommended practices for early intervention. And so practices is kind of a different look than a model. Practices will be a different look than a curriculum, which is really the scope and sequence of what we're teaching to children or others. And practices help us develop intervention, but it is the repertoire of practices that we're trying to influence. So as you try to influence your system to move outcomes, we're going to be influencing the use of practices by practitioners. This will become more apparent as we keep talking about this. So Mary Louise and I are developers of the pyramid model, along with many other of our colleagues, the developers of the pyramid model for promoting social emotional competence for infants and young children. And this model now has been articulated for how do you apply it within early intervention systems, infant and toddler classrooms, preschool classrooms, and we're working right now on kindergarten as well. It's a framework of practices again. So it is the identification of practices that practitioners use to promote social emotional competence, to help children who have social emotional delays, as well as intervene with children who have more significant delays or persistent challenging behavior. When we talk about it, we describe it as a framework of practices. And so these practices, actually, if you were using family guided routines-based intervention, you can still pull these social emotional promotion practices within that delivery model. And when we work with classroom-based programs, we help them see that regardless of curricula that they might be using or the way that they've structured their program, the pyramid model practices are the ones that will help them move the needle for children's social emotional outcome. And they can be used with different curriculum models or different early childhood approaches in our classroom programs. So what is the whole issue around the use of practices is that we need to know what they are in order to influence change in practices. So to start this work, the bottom line is you need to be operating from a list. You need to have a notion of what it is you're trying to get people to do. And with that list, we need them to do those practices with fidelity. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the list could be DEC recommended practices. And I think the slides are going to be posted with the recording later, so you'll have access to this. For pyramid model, we have the list around our infant toddler classroom practices. We have a list for preschool classroom practices, and we have that list for early intervention practices. And I think that's really important for moving the needle, for establishing, for getting it in place. And so one thing to think about in your systems is, do we have a list? And have we articulated what the list is to the practitioners who are working within our system? So let's talk about evidence-based practices and what it really takes for outcomes. And this kind of brings us to the rest of our talk. Is we're going to rely on practitioners to use evidence-based practices with fidelity. So we need to think through, what does it take to get them there? And then how does that work for influencing child outcomes? And so define practices, you need the list. And once we have that list of practices, we need a way to know whether or not where our teachers are or where our early intervention practitioners are. So we need to know kind of what are their strengths. We need to know their interests in learning new practices or the importance of a set of practices to their work. So some process for identifying for that individual practitioner, how do I move them from where they are to fidelity of practice implementation. And so knowing where they are is really important. Now we know we need to provide training. And we need to provide the content so that people know what these practices are that are missing out of their practice repertoire, or learn about practices that they may not have thought about using that would really strengthen the intervention or the instruction that they're providing to children. And so training is a given, but training can't do it all. I mean, this is kind of, we all know that, right? In professional development, that training is necessary but insufficient for practice change. And so we have done now, I guess, a decade of work around coaching and how important coaching is to getting practitioners to fidelity of practices. And I think it's not just pyramid model people who are saying we need practice-based coaching. I think uniformly across the field of professional development, we are learning that people need support to implement complex things, and especially complex things like helping teachers, helping family members and people who coach, helping them do something as kind of complex and comprehensive as moving children's social emotional outcomes. Once we have fidelity of practices, then we can look at the thing that, you know, we're aiming to do in our systems. So in an early intervention systems, what you want is you want your early interventionists to be at fidelity with the practices. And then you want them to take those practices in their practice repertoire and use them with fit to each child and family that they're supporting. And of course, the goal of the early interventionist is to be able to help the family use interventions that will move child outcomes. In classroom programs, what we want is our classroom practitioners to get to fidelity and then to be able to design intervention, curriculum, instructional activities that will move those child outcomes. Thus, that is why thinking about what does it take to get to fidelity of practices is really should be front and center as we think about our professional development systems. So I'm going to pause for a minute and say, Mary Louise is going to look at the chat. So if you have questions, chat them in and she'll interrupt me and use that. So if you have a question, I'm going to just keep moving on because I don't want to take up too much time and I want to have a discussion. Everybody good so far? If not, throw something in the chat and I can back up. All right, so that brings me to wanting to describe to you this idea of practice-based coaching, where it came from, what it's about. I'm going to invite Mary Louise to also comment because she's one of the lead authors of this framework. Practice-based coaching was designed by a group of us to examine. We designed it by examining the literature of what works in providing coaching, and in particular, coaching in early childhood. What are the really active evidence-based ingredients that need to be in a coaching framework? This framework was developed probably a decade ago, I would say, Mary Louise, is that correct, with the research elements of it?
Really more than a decade ago. I mean, we really started it in, like 2007 or 8.
Oh, for sure. I don't know why. I think at the early development work that you had been doing with around early literacy and some other things too played into this, right? So, well, we've been working on it for a long time. It was very nice through the National Center for Quality Teaching and Learning to land on a logo that we continue to use. And in Head Start, they're using it, and we're using it in early intervention and in early childhood and early childhood special ed, which is fantastic because then we're all on the same page, right? And having the same framework. So the practice-based coaching framework, the circle denotes that we're going to have multiple cycles. The process, the components of it is within the circle called a collaborative partnership. And so that's a collaborative partnership between the coach and the coachee. And in the center, you see pyramid model practices, because of course we would say really consider that for moving your social emotional outcomes. But what I want to say to you is the center's where your list goes. So the center's where the DEC practices go, or the pyramid model practices. And that creates a shared focus of what we're going to work on together as we do that coaching. So it's very intentionally focused and very specific about moving practices. The core components of practice-based.
Can I say one, sorry, Lisa, can I say one thing about that? I was thinking after we did this the other day that, what's in the middle isn't something you have to develop. In other words, I think sometimes people think, oh, we have to come up with a set of practices, but you don't. You have to come up with what your goal is, and then there are sets of practices, DEC practices, pyramid practices, embedded instruction practices, early literacy practices. So it's not something that you have to come up with. They exist. But the other thing I was thinking about related to this was about how people, it seems like in programs a lot, we move from one thing to the other. And so then people aren't ever really clear what you're supposed to be doing when someone comes out to coach you. And by having those practices clearly identified, then people know what it is that's going to be the focus of coaching.
And actually in our work, that's what people have really valued, is that has been so operationalized for them and well articulated, and they know what this is all about. So it really stages coaching in a much better way, much more transparent way. So we always have these components: the planning, goals, and action steps, having a focused observation, reflection, and feedback. And those elements are there. And then you have multiple cycles of coaching, trying to move people to higher fidelity, as well as the achievement of an action plan, which moves them incrementally to fidelity on the whole list of practices, is what we would ambitiously go for. So that's practice-based coaching. Here's a really quick video where a coach reflects on the use of practice-based coaching in her early childhood work. This is from a program, an early childhood school in New Jersey.
Practice-based coaching is the model that I use working with my teachers in regards to a pyramid model. And that looks like the first step is really assessing the needs of the classroom, meeting with the teacher, letting them know what's going to happen, what the cycles look like. And then I usually schedule my teapot after that first meeting. And the teapot really gives me a full picture of the classroom. And then when we meet again to debrief the teapot observation, at that point, then we can work together collaboratively on action planning and goal setting. So that would kind of conclude step one. And then I would come back, we'd set our goal. We'd set another meeting for a more focused observation. We would debrief that again, and then we would look at the cycle, look at the observations, see if there were more strategies that we can put in the classroom, brainstorm ideas together for support, and it's a cyclical fashion. So we set the goal, we plan how we're going to achieve the goal, and then we come back and debrief.
So one of the very lovely things is her use of we, and all of this, because coaching in practice-based coaching to a coachee feels really supportive. The coach is kind of it's a safe relationship. It's not a supervisory relationship where people really feel supported to do kind of hard work in learning new practices or using practices of fidelity. So we've done many studies on practice-based coaching. If you want to know if it's evidence-based, this lists randomized trials and experiments related to it, around pyramid model, around embedded instruction, and around other social emotional interventions. So there's plenty of evidence for the effectiveness of the practice-based coaching approach. One of the things that's interesting, I think, about practice-based coaching in that circle with those core elements is you can do that distance or live. You can do that with someone with expertise who is supporting the coachee. We can also train peers to coach each other, and so that may be a different way to deliver it. Or you can, there's been some experiences with setting up materials where people really engage in self-coaching, but still use those elements. And that might be delivered to an individual group or any combination or hybrid of all of those things. What's important is that we're using the core components. What's important is you have a defined set of practices in the middle, that you start with goal setting and a needs assessment, so you know what practices you're going to work with the coachee on, and there is agreement that we're going to work on those. It always has an observation component and always has reflection and feedback. And so those elements could be delivered in multiple ways and in different formats, which I think is great for us, especially you systems folks, as we're trying to think about the match of coaching to a coachee, as well as trying to figure out how to make coaching work within our systems and meet the needs of coachees who are in various places in their level of proficiency. So in addition to how are we going to deliver coaching, we also want to think about what makes coaching effective so that we do move practitioners in their use of practices. And so we would say think about the adherence to the coaching model or practice-based coaching. So making sure we're doing that with fidelity is important. The quality in which that is done is important. And then the dosage. And we've learned that in our work that for complex set of practices, like the complete set of pyramid model practices, the dosage has to be fairly high. Our teachers have needed a lot of coaching to get to high fidelity. Of course, we're trying to get them there really fast so that we can see outcomes for children, which we do. But we need to think about that dosage. So 1 or 2 cycles of coaching might work for a very, very simple practice, a very, very simple skill, but multiple cycles of coaching will be necessary for things that are more complex or for an expanded set of practices that we might use. Mary Louise, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? No? Okay, great. All right. So we want to think about doing it with fidelity in the manner I stated, doing it with quality and sufficient dosage. Bringing it to a program has lots of implications. And so when we bring coaching in, we also then need to think about the systems that might be used to ensure that we sustain practices. And so we're going to want to check and make sure that when we've got people to fidelity, they stay at fidelity. We're going to remind folks in the program about what these practices are. I think that's one of the successes of the pyramid model, is people really adopt it program-wide. They keep talking about it. They keep revisiting it. We want to know if there's slippage in any practice that we're implementing and maybe revisit that with professional development or goal setting. You could do that across practitioners in a program. And then what programs begin to do is bring those practices that are important to them into their policies, their procedure, their curricula. So they're really institutionalizing the practices within the program. In the pyramid model, it kind of looks like this. In the pyramid model, we guide programs to establish a leadership team, and that goes for our early intervention programs as well as our classroom-based programs. So we say, if you're going to do this, if you're going to say we're about using this framework, this set of practices, then someone needs to be thinking about the implementation infrastructure to make that happen. This is a picture of what it looks like for our classroom programs. So a leadership team thinks about, what does it take for us to be implementing this set of practices? How do we get staff bought in? How do we engage families around this? How will we respond to kids? What are our systems for kids who have challenging behaviors, since that's a piece of this? But the coaching piece is there, the continuous professional development and the coaching. And so somebody is thinking through, how will we get a coach? How will we train our coaches? How will we assign our coaches? How will we do coaching agreements? And thinking about that continuously, including data elements around coaching, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So how do we know our teachers at fidelity? And how do we know we're coaching them with fidelity? How do we know the coaching's working? All of those are what the leadership team thinks about. And so in their work around coaching, they're really creating this culture of coaching. They're thinking about those policies, those agreements, they're planning for it, they're communicating with coaches, they're supporting their coaches, as well as guiding the coaches and thinking about how to establish a collaborative partnership, the ongoing communication. Coaches are on the leadership team typically and are having dialogue about their work and what's going on with helping move those practitioners. I know it sounds complicated, and maybe it sounds, if you haven't done this work, I think some of you on this call have done it, and I hope you share that in your breakouts. Some of you may be new to it. What's super exciting to me is right now about 30 states are doing this and making this happen, and countless programs really have been able to do this. And I think part of their willingness to kind of engage in this big lift is how impactful it is on the program and people's use of the practices. So depending on where a program is, there are things to think about, and I've included these slides for you of kind of following the implementation stages. So you could be in your state at exploration or in your program at exploration, where you're trying to figure out, well, if we want to bring coaching, is practice-based coaching what we bring? I would say resoundingly, please, please examine it and explore it. We have lots of resources for you to do that because it's designed for early childhood programs and it is practice focused. But you're going to need to think about how would we get that in place in that exploration and what are we trying to move the needle on in terms of those practices. When you get into the early installation, programs need to figure out how do we identify and train coaches. They'll need some kind of coaching protocol, and we have samples for you. They'll need to know what strengths and needs assessment tool could we use, and we can guide you around that. For pyramid practices, we have those designed already. Think about the professional development, the coaching kind of bookends to support. What's the coaching caseload? And the schedule, what can we really accomplish? Often we'll tell programs start small so that you can gain experience with this and know how it works, and then begin to expand and scale up. We always ask that coaches and coachees enter into an agreement around coaching so they articulate the relationship as they begin the coaching. And then as you implement, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing, which was just that when you were talking about the coaching agreements, I was thinking about how this approach to coaching could feel really different for teachers than any professional development they've received in the past. And we hear people say all the time, I've never had anything like this that was just supportive and ongoing and not evaluative. So I think part of what we want to be sure we do before a teacher provider signs an agreement is just help them understand what PBC is relative to previous experiences.
Great. So I have a slide on implementation and full implementation. And actually, we have a really nice document free on our website that is a program leader's guide to practice-based coaching that really talks about these steps and really thinking through how will we do our orientation, how will we assign coaches to coachees, how to schedule, kind of thinking through the time and time allocation, what coaches need for their supervision and support. And then, of course, we want to inform families that we're doing coaching and what coaching is about. And then we move into full implementation. And so thinking about sustainability, thinking about turnover, thinking about new coaches, all of those things that you need to think about. Because the idea of coaching is not a one shot. Let me get everyone to fidelity, move the outcomes, and we're all going to be fine. You're sophisticated system leaders. You know it never works out like that. We're going to have to bring coaching into our professional development system and think about it as personnel supports and think about how to integrate it into that work so that we can continually support the practitioners who work with us in this really big work. So is there anything in the chat or anything I left out, Mary Louise? You're shaking your head. All right.
Sorry, I was talking and I was on mute. Poor Lisa. Poor Lisa. I just did another webinar, so I'm a little spacey right now. So anyway, yes, I was looking at the chat. There's nothing. So anyway. All right. So we are going to give y'all a little bit of time to talk in some smaller groups about what Lisa has just shared with you. And I think we want y'all to talk about two things. So one is kind of what have been your challenges related to coaching and what have been your challenges related to practice change. So I think, and we'll talk about this a little more after the groups, you know, one of the things we want to be sure is that we're measuring whether our coaching is being effective, and the way that we can measure if our coaching has been effective is to measure if it's changing practice. So we want to be thoughtful about, do we have measures or do we have instruments that measure practice change? So we're going to give y'all about 20 minutes to talk in your groups about the challenges and successes you've had and strategies that have worked, those kind of things. And then we're going to ask each group to identify someone who can just share back a couple of ideas or main thoughts that y'all had as part of your group discussion. So Katie's going to put you in groups. We'll give you 20 minutes. Is that good, Lisa? 15. Sorry, I see the slide. 15.
Great.
Katie will give you a warning a few minutes before your time is up. And just remember to have somebody be the recorder so that you can bring it back to the large group.
Thanks for coming back and joining us again. We had a poll before that we wanted to do. I want to do it right now. Katie, if you'll pull it up, and then we'll talk about, want to hear what y'all talked about. So we were interested in, do you have a defined set of practices that you're working on? So do you have the list of practices for your system? And are you working in a program or system that does ongoing training in practices? Do you do coaching? And so do you do like multiple cycles of coaching, that kind of model of coaching, like what we described? And if you're doing coaching, do you have a measure of fidelity? And are you measuring these practices that you're trying to get folks to do? If you don't mind, if you could just put in your answers about those, we find it interesting for this topic. All right, so it's open for you to put your answers in. Great. So people have practices that are defined, awesome, are doing training, are measuring whether or not people are doing them. Looks like some people are working on coaching. All right. Anybody else want to answer? We have about half of you in here. All right, well, let's talk. Let's learn more about what's going on with you.
All right, so I'm going to take back over here, I guess. So if we can just, we really ended up with only one group because the other group, anyway, so let's hear back from the group, the designated reporter from the group, what y'all talked about.
So this is Lou Ann Mullins, and our group said it was breakout group 1. Is that all there is?
Yeah, the other group was small and people left, and then there was only one person.
Oh, okay.
Where are you from, Lou Ann?
I'm from Oklahoma.
Okay.
I am the assistant executive director with the Part C program, and our Part C program, all of our providers are state employees. Mm-hmm. So we have, it's kind of like one big program, although we have several sites. So it is pretty, we do the same thing everywhere. One of the downsides, I guess, sometimes is people talk about incentives and sanctions, and we have very few other than employment because there's no grant process to each site since we're all employed. But in talking about the challenges, I can say that we kind of lost track of some of the questions, but we were talking about the challenges of practice-based coaching and coaching in general. And one of the challenges mentioned was coaching in childcare settings versus coaching families in their homes. Because a lot of times there's not a buy-in in the childcare setting, or there's not really places, people to coach if they're not actually paying that close attention when you're trying to do services with an adult learner in a childcare setting. So that was a challenge in the coaching process. Other challenges we talked about was just building capacity to have provider-based coaching, because when you have, in our situation in Oklahoma, our supervisors in each site carry caseloads. They are not dedicated supervisors. They're all related service providers that just have additional duties as supervisors, is really how it would be, more so than the other way around. And so as supervisors, they're going to have very little ability and capacity to do any type of supervision or practice-based coaching. And so that's something in Oklahoma that we are really struggling with in building capacity. One state, Kentucky, was talking about, they contract for coaches through a university system. And then another has offered, although they don't have a formalized coaching methodology, they're supporters or supportive supervisors, I guess, of their routines-based intervention process. They offer them incentives, some type of monetary incentive, or had just gotten that underway. And then I think Kentucky said they were also trying to come up with some type of incentive for even for their providers, and looking at that. So those were some of the challenges, and then some of the things that, people were doing. I know that what, I forgot who said it, was they're using I don't know the names of all the different types of coaching methodologies, but the Sheldon and Rush coaching process, and that they have been very, very successful with that, and that they feel like they are at fidelity, and so they are continuing to monitor and check up on that. So that was kind of our discussions.
Okay, good. I mean, I'll be interested, Lisa, if you have something, but my first thought when you were talking was how we've just got to figure out how to build a system that supports coaching. That I just think in so many contexts that we're trying to coach with, like, if we're working in childcare, who is it that you even train to be a coach, right? And who pays them to be a coach? It's easier to think about how you do it in Head Start and public schools, but it's really hard to think about EI programs and childcare programs where you even get the coaches. And I think one of the things that we've been really interested in thinking about is how you kind of really create program supports around coaching. And it's just hard because there are some programs that don't have the resources to really do it. I don't know, Lisa, did you have anything else?
No, I was interested. It seems like you had a lot of EI, or maybe you had half EI and half 619 in your group. So with the EI, even if you're using Sheldon and Rush or Family Guided Routines-Based Intervention or RBI, the practice-based coaching, kind of, if you're striving to get people to fidelity of implementation of practices within that, or social emotional teaching practices, or a set of DEC practices, practice-based coaching still can fit. And it really is a different way to think. It's about thinking about how do we coach our interventionists to get stronger. Luann, the Nevada is implementing, and they struggle too. They have a large state system with just a few community programs. And so that was really hard for us to figure out who would do coaching within each of those state EI programs. And really large, like Las Vegas is just huge numbers of early interventionists. And so, they're landing, I would say their coaching is probably more peer coaching. So we've trained practice EIs within the program who have multiple roles. And so they're doing it, they're biting off small so that we can achieve it and kind of test it. And actually, when everyone went telehealth, it really was a blessing because it made it that much easier to kind of do and make a difference with. So I think we're all learning how to bring it to systems.
All right. I think I'm going to move us on because now we get to spend our last 30 minutes talking about data and how to use data. and we're right on schedule. So thank y'all. Thank you, Luann, for being the reporter. We appreciate that. All right, so we're going to move in, as I said, to talking about, there we go, to talking about data sources and how to use data. And so we're going to start out by talking a little bit about data sources. So we have one more poll for you. Yeah, there we go. So our poll this time is, what social emotional observation tools are you using? And these are the ones that we came up with. And if you don't know them or you're not using it, that's okay. But if you are and could just indicate it, that would be great. So just to kind of guide you, oh, there's someone using the DEC recommended practices. Okay, wait, I need to wait a minute, sorry. There we go. So it really looks like from those of y'all who have responded, that you're either using something specifically aligned with the curriculum you're using, or you're using the DEC recommended practices checklists. So, all right, well, we're gonna talk about tools you're not using as examples, but I think it'll still be relevant to the work that you're doing. So, all right, so can we close the poll? There we go. So, all right. So I'm gonna just do a real quick overview of the TPOT, which is the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool. And mostly we're doing this to show you the data process, less than to teach you about a tool. But just because we have data, have used the TPOT a lot, this will be a good way to give y'all an example. So the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool is designed for preschool classrooms, so classrooms serving primarily children ages 2 to 5. And it has two sections that we're going to talk about today. It has a set of practices that we call key practice items, and then it has a set of items that we call red flags. And these are the key excuse me, the key practice items that the TPOT measures. And so these are practices that are primarily related to implementing universal practices for kids in the classroom, but get into a little bit of more targeted interventions and teachers' capacity to use those interventions. These items are scored based on a 2-hour observation and about a 20-minute interview. And some items you score just based on the observation, and some items you score based on the observation and interview, and some you score just based on the interview. I mentioned that we have these items that we call red flags, and what red flags are practices that are counterproductive, or maybe that are less likely to support children's engagement and social emotional development. And we call them red flags because we think that if they're happening in classrooms, that should be the place that professional development starts. So an example of a red flag is that children are reprimanded for communicating their emotions, or emotions are never talked about in the classroom, or transitions are more often chaotic than not, or the majority of the day is spent in teacher-directed activities. And so we would say if there are red flags in classrooms, that's where we would want professional development to start. So kind of keep that in mind, and I'm going to talk through how we would apply this database decision-making framework to TPOT data. So, so in this framework, we think about look, think, act. So that's kind of our process for using data to make decisions. And I just want to say that, you know, I think all of us work in a lot of programs that collect a lot of data that never goes anywhere. And we really focus on collecting data that can help us make good decisions in our work. And so what the teapot's going to do is help us make good decisions about professional development, coaching, training, professional development. And so in the Look, Think, Act process, if you think about the teapot data that I was just talking about, or the teapot items that I was just talking about, the look part of the process might be looking at the number of red flags, or looking at the percent of indicators that teachers are getting credit for. The think part would be, what do those data tell us and what do they mean? So are there concerns about red flags? Are there a lot of red flags? Are the red flags consistent across all teachers, or do teachers have different red flags? If there is a consistent red flag, have we done training on whatever's related to that red flag? If the red flags vary across teachers, that tells us something really different than if every teacher has a common red flag, right? So we might, as we're looking at those data, we might think, if we're looking at the key practice indicators and we're looking at the ones around challenging behavior and how teachers respond to challenging behaviors, or the process for supporting kids who have more persistent behavior, if teachers aren't getting credit for that, that kind of tells us that as a program, we're not doing something right. And so that would push us into thinking about a change in maybe our procedures at the program level. Whereas if teachers aren't doing well on an item related to transitions, it might tell us about some kind of training we need to do. So that's the way that we want to think about it. And I'm going to show you some data that we can think through. And I'm going to get y'all to talk here. So I'm going to do the look part. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this graph is. So this graph is a teacher's teapot data, and it's their data from the spring and the fall. The fall and the spring, so the beginning of the school year and the end of the school year. These are each of the key practice items that I was talking about a minute ago. And the way you can think about this is how the teacher was doing before we did some training and coaching, and the red line is how the teacher is doing after a year of having some support. So when you look at that, when you look at these data, and so just to explain what the data mean, so in an item like schedules, routines, and activities, there might be 10 indicators. And so what these data tell you is that, like at the beginning, the teacher was getting 80% of those indicators. And by the end of the year, the teacher was getting 100% of those indicators. Okay. So when you look at this graph, what are some things you notice? This is not a rhetorical question. I really mean for you guys to tell me what you see in the data.
Everybody's done well. It's great. They really improved across the board.
Yeah, so this is just one teacher across a lot of items. And what you see, you're right, Donna, he has made progress on every single item on the teapot, which is really exciting. And given what we know about how hard it is to move teapot scores in a academic year, these data look really good. What else do you notice?
A lot of the information the teacher has learned, it doesn't seem like it's been shared with the family, I guess.
Okay.
Because that's a low, if that's what that particular item means in supporting the family in the use of those models, those practices that they have mastered, and maybe not mastered, but have learned, have not necessarily been shared.
So that's a really good point, Luann, that the teacher's clearly making progress on implementing these practices, but it doesn't look like the teachers made progress on sharing these practices with families. And in some ways that makes some sense, right? Until you're really comfortable with them, you might not share them with families, right? So, but it clearly gives us a place to focus our support for this teacher, right? So even though teaching friendship skills is a little bit low, we might want to do a little bit of work there. It would really point us in our coaching to do some action planning, the cycle that Lisa talked about around this item, right? So around how you share information with families. So I think a really important part of coaching is being able to use data to make good decisions about how you're doing coaching. And that's an example of how a coach could use these data to decide where to support the teacher next. Okay, now let's look at this one. And this is getting more, a little bit more at what Donna was talking about. So now we've got 8 teachers. So each of these bars represents 8 teachers. So it represents their average score in the fall, or at the beginning of the school year. In the middle of the school year would be the red bar, and in the green is towards the end of the school year. So this is an average of 8 teachers on each of the teapot items. Now what do you see?
Well, it looks like growth over time.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there's a steady kind of improvement or a level, or in some, there was like a drop off. So you can see people have made steady improvements, or they got good and then they fell.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, there's been a lot of improvement.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Donna. So you see kind of good steady growth overall, right? So if you look at this last one, this is a summary of all those combined. So you can see overall that they are definitely making progress. And I think your point about a few of the items like this one, and I think there was one other one here, fell off a little bit. That is something we see really consistently in our work around coaching teachers, that as they try to use new things, sometimes their use of the things they were working on previously go down a little bit because it's just a lot to keep in your head. And I think that what that suggests is kind of what we know about learning, right? Is that you learn something and you can do it, but it takes lots of practice over time to get it really firmly in your repertoire. And that's probably what's happening there, is that they've got it, but they're maybe overloaded with trying to think about too much as new practices come in. That's a really good point. What else do you notice? Since there's not many of you on here, and so you don't have to answer every time, Donna, I'll just tell you a couple of other things that I think are important to notice here. So when you look, so one thing I would say is that one thing that I think is really important is that these data show you how this group of teachers are doing overall, right? But if you think about each of these bars represents 8 teachers and the average across 8 teachers, it still means that you have some teachers that are pretty low on some of these indicators. So if you just think about like, where's one? This one is 70%. Well, to have 70% across 8 teachers, you could have some really high teachers and you could have some really low teachers. So I think that on average, this tells us that our PD and our coaching is working pretty well overall. But what I would want to do, so we might look at these ones that are pretty high and say, those are not things that we need to revisit for our whole group of teachers, right? Because if they're up between 80 and 90%, then most of the teachers are doing pretty well, right? But we might want to say, who are the teachers who aren't doing so well? And let's get some targeted support to them, all right? But if we look at one like this, which is teaching problem solving, nobody's doing really great. And so that might be something that we say, we're going to do some really good training for them as a group around problem solving. Maybe we do more of a group coaching thing around social problem solving, right? Because everybody needs some support around that. So those are the kinds of questions we would want to ask is, who's doing well, who needs, what level of support do people need? I think one of the things we feel really strongly about with practice-based coaching is that not everybody needs the same dose and intensity of coaching. And most of our programs can't afford to provide everybody the intensity of coaching that we think people need. And so how do we decide who gets more intense coaching and who gets less intense coaching? And by more and less, it goes back to that Rubik's Cube that Lisa showed earlier. I don't mean who gets good coaching and who gets less good coaching. I mean, who gets more intensive dosage. So if we look at this bar right here around teaching friendship skills, and most teachers are doing good, but Lisa and Donna are really struggling, then we might want to get more frequent coaching to them and put the rest of them in a group and have them work collaboratively, but using the group coaching, using the PBC cycle in that group. Okay, does that make sense? So we're making decisions about PD based on the data that we're seeing from the teachers. Questions?
Hi, this is Robin. I have a question.
Sure.
So this is really nice data to, maintain, like you said, for PD purposes. I'm just wondering if this coaching process, does it compare child progress data to teacher data? And
So
if so, what are the results? I mean, if teachers are doing so well, so are the children progressing? That's my question. Over.
That's a really good question, Robin. And in our research, when teachers get up to where they're using about 7, so just using TPOT as an example, when they get to where they're using about, on average, about 70% of the practices, we see changes in in teachers' report of children's social skills and challenging behavior improvements. So yes, we do see those changes, but yes, that would be the easy answer. I do think that what's important about it is, what's important from the frame of coaching is that it's pretty hard to get teachers on average to 70%. And so, I think we are very aware that we are doing research in really controlled ways, and teachers are getting really high doses of coaching, and we're getting effects because of that, and that's not scalable. In other words, not every program is going to be able to get every teacher the dose of coaching we were able to provide in our research studies. So what we want people to, part of the reason for talking about this today is thinking about, how do we get people the amount of coaching they need to get them to 70%. So some of the teachers in our studies started out pretty high, like 55, 60% of practices, and they still got the same amount of coaching as the teachers who started out lower. And that was because it was a research study. But in practice, that would tell us something really important, which is that teacher who's at 60% probably needs less coaching to get to a point of seeing child change than the teacher who starts out at like 19%. All right, so I'm gonna just move on because of course we're running short on time. I just wanna make you aware, and we're not gonna talk about this tool, but we also have a tool called the Tippy Toes, which stands for the Pyramid Infant Toddler Observation Scale. So it does what the teapot does, except you use it in classrooms that primarily serve children under the age of 3, so infants and toddlers, but it is designed in much the same way as the teapot. And one thing I'll just say about both the teapot and the Tippy Toes is that even though you have to buy the tools, there is an Excel spreadsheet that you can use to get the kinds of graphs that we just showed you. So you put in the data and it will spit out graphs by teacher, by programs, by any number of variables that you might want to examine. These are the things the Tippy Toes measures. Lisa, you want to talk about this real quick?
Well, I'll just mention that we do have a tool for early intervention. So even if you're using a different, bigger model, family guided routines-based intervention or RBI, this tool would give you the set of practices that are about moving the needle around social emotional outcomes. So it's practices that the early interventionists would use in their work within whatever model you're doing to really focus on helping families around social emotional outcomes. So it's not published commercially, so it is on our website free for download if you're interested in it, and it does have companion spreadsheets to help you look at movement towards fidelity and what you can do around making database decisions with that. So both practitioner by practitioner, and then I think the next graphic output shows that you could also scan across practitioners to see growth in the practices.
So we've really, I think, attempted with our tools to make database decision making easier by having a way to summarize data in a, I think fairly, I can do it, so that suggests it's a fairly usable, feasible system. So, all right, so what I'm going to talk about for these last few minutes is coaching fidelity. And this is something that I feel pretty strongly about because I think that that there's a lot of things going on in the field in the name of coaching that people say, yeah, we do coaching when teachers need it, or we do coaching. And when you ask people to talk about what their coaching looks like or how often they do it or what their caseload is, people often can't talk about that. And I think that part of that is because it's rare that coaching is the primary job of people. And so people are doing coaching, but they're also doing other roles. And we're doing work in a school system right now where we're trying to do coaching with people who are full-time, working with coaches who are full-time coaches, and they get pulled to do other things all the time. And so we think it's really important before we start saying, is coaching working, to say, so Robin asked a minute ago, is if teachers make progress, do we get changes in children? And what we would say is we shouldn't ask if teachers are making progress until we know that we're doing coaching in the way that it was designed to be done, with enough dosage and intensity that you would expect to see change in teacher and practitioner practices. So again, I'm going to run through this really quickly. All of this is on challengingbehavior.org, but we have tools that you can use to track your coaching. So we have a classroom coaching log, which is a log that coaches can fill out each time they go to do a coaching visit. And it gives you information about how many, what you did during that visit, what strategies you used, what action plan you worked on, how long you were there, all of that kind of information. It too can be put into an Excel file so that you can track coaching dosage across teachers, classrooms, programs. We have a Look, Think, Act guide for how coaches can use data to support teachers. And then we have a tool that defines different coaching strategies that coaches can use in their work with teachers. And all of these pieces are linked. So the coaching strategies are on the coaching log. So we've just tried to make this a linked system that will help you monitor coaching dosage and fidelity. We have similar tools for if you're coaching early intervention practitioners. Same tools, just with a different focus. So I want to just show you one piece of data to kind of think about how you could use coaching data. So these data are data from a coach who's working with 5 teachers, and you would get this information from the coaching log. So what you can see from this information is the number of coaching cycles the coach attempted, the number that were completed, the percent that were completed. So you can see for 4 of the teachers, all of the coaching cycles that the coach attempted to do were completed. And for one of the teachers, a coaching cycle wasn't completed. And then you can see how long the observations lasted. So that kind of tells you about the dosage of coaching. Now let's look at whether teachers are achieving their action plan goals as a result of coaching. All right. So what we see on this graph is that you can look at the graph, but one of the things I think is important to note is that 2 of the teachers are not meeting many of their action plan goals. And so to understand that, one piece of data we might look at is, are they getting coaching? So that's teacher 3 and teacher 5. So if we go back to this, it looks like teacher 3's getting pretty reliable coaching, and teacher 5, even though one coaching cycle wasn't completed, he's getting some, but getting fewer sessions. The other thing you notice is that both teacher 3 and teacher 5 have had fewer cycles attempted. And that might be why these data are lower, and it might not be why, but it is one way to begin to look at that. When I ask coaches to talk about coaches in the field versus coaches on our research project, when I ask coaches in the field to talk about how often their coaching attempts are complete, it seems like people say about half the time, meaning about half the time they go out to do a coaching visit, they actually get to finish the coaching visit. And that's for a million reasons. But those data from an administrative perspective are really important for programs to know. If coaches are going out to do visits twice as often as they're completing visits, that's really important data, right? That means teachers are getting half of the planned dosage of coaching. All right, I know we are right up against our time, so I just want to point out that on our website, there are a ton of resources related to coaching. I host a webinar series about unpacking coaching I can say it's really good because it's usually not me talking. We have real coaches talking about real issues and how they do it in the field. Those are all archived for you to listen to. We have lots of fact sheets on what is practice-based coaching, how do we implement practice-based coaching, how do we do how do we do action planning. And some of these, like the action planning one, goes really deep into how to action plan. So there's tools for action planning, and then there's a webinar that kind of gets at how do you really do good action planning. The last thing I just want to mention is that we also have Pyramid Model Equity Coaching Guide. And what that is really about is the idea that there are obviously issues of equity and how discipline practices are implemented in programs. And many people think that's related to people's implicit bias. And so what we've developed is a guide that really supports coaches and teachers to examine issues of equity in classrooms and to provide teachers support around addressing any biases that they might have or any inequitable use of practices in the classroom. All right, I'm 1 minute over. You're going to get a survey. Is that right? Oh, yes. Please remember to fill out your survey. And this is really serious. In all of our projects, we take these survey data very important, especially when it's a webinar about data. So we would love to have your feedback. And thank you for being here today. We know it's the end of a long few days, so we appreciate you being here.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.